Welcome back, fellow Blender users, to another Minecraft Earth tutorial, and we're finally doing part 3 in this series, which, if you didn't know, this is the last part in this tutorial series, so don't cry, we still need to get through this, but yeah, this is the end of the line. So, in part 1, we talked about how to make the crater itself, so we have this crater, that's one object, it's shaded, it's good to go. In the second tutorial, we talked about camera tracking, which means that now if we play this footage, it's going to be very slow because we're using cycles rendering to get this crater rendered, but everything is matching up and aligning because our camera is pretty much mimicking the real-world motion of the camera that was in the original footage, which I am trying to play without audio because I don't know why, but I just always forget. So yeah, we're pulling camera data from here. And now what we want to do is integrate the two. So we have part 1, part 2, and part 3 is about connecting these pieces into what hopefully looks like this. Right? And the main issue we have here is we have the movement right, we have the crater that looks pretty good, but we don't have this texture up top that blends the two together. So right now you can see the side of this crater. If we go back into Blender, you can see the side of it. That's not what we want. So we're going to be doing a lot of stuff with compositing and projecting to basically get rid of that. But before we start any of that good stuff that I just mentioned, there is something that is a bit of a concern, and you guys mentioned it in the comments in the last video. And that is that this background image that you see right here, let me zoom out, this background image is a bit misaligned. I mean, it's going a bit to the right and maybe a bit up, and you'd expect it to be centered. And first of all, the reason that this is the case is pretty much, I think it's because of the optical center calculation we did when camera tracking. It's not an issue we can fix for this, but just be aware that this is kind of off to the corner. So let's first talk about why this is an issue, and then we'll talk about how to fix it. So let's render as is, basically, so we're not going to worry about this top right issue. So right now, if we go to the compositing, again, this says what's going to be rendered. So right now we have our movie clip, which is the sequence. It's getting undistorted, so no lens distortion, and that's basically being fed into the compositor here. Well, first of all, we want to add our crater back in, so it's overlaid over our sequence. To do this, I'm just going to go to the first frame so we can see everything over here. We're going to add in, that's Shift A for add, and we're going to add in I don't know where to find it specifically, but I do know what it's called, so it's called render layers. And render layers basically says, look at what's in the 3D viewport and bring that in and store it inside this node. So right now you see it's set to foreground, which is the only option. Again, in our 3D viewport, we are using this foreground layer. If we added another, we could choose which one we want, foreground or background, but we just want foreground. Again, everything inside the 3D viewport stored here, and then to overlay it on top, we're going to add Shift A alpha over. You can also use mix RGB, but alpha over is probably the way to go with this. So what we're going to do is we want our render layers to be in the foreground. We want it to be on top of our footage. And in Blender, the way this works is foreground is in this bottom slot right here. Might not be what you're used to if you use Photoshop or After Effects or anything where the top layer is the one that's in the foreground, but here it's the reverse. So take this image right here and we're going to bring it into the foreground, which again is the bottom slot. And then we want to use this undistorted video over here as the background. So we're not going to import from here, but rather from this end of the chain over here, essentially. There we go. And then finally, we want to take this overlaid thing that we made over here, and we want this to be in the viewer, so it's what we see, and also the composite, which is what gets rendered. And you're going to notice that right now we did all this, but you're still only seeing the image sequence. You're not seeing any of the crater that we made. Well, the issue here isn't the node network, but we actually didn't render anything. So render layers will only store our information when we actually do a render. So if we go to the render tab and take our render samples and bring it down to something like 2, just so it renders quickly at low quality, and then we hit F12 for render, or you can just go to render image, which is F12. So I'm going to hit F12. It's going to render, but you're going to notice that we don't get our background. In fact, we get this kind of gray Aether kind of thing. Aether is actually a mod pack in Minecraft, so we're making connections here. But this is definitely not what we want, and the reason that we have this gray background is if we go back to shading, we haven't been here in a while, and we go to world, you're going to see that our background has this gray. If we change it to red or this dark red, and then we render again, now we're going to get this dark red. Either way, we don't want any color that we could pick here. So what we can do is either mess around with the shading, with the world and all that. I don't like doing this approach. Instead, what I do, which is much easier, is in the render tab under film, we're going to turn on transparent. And this is going to make our background non-existent, essentially. So now if we hit F12, we get our crater, and then you see we actually get in our background, which in this corner over here, you see some part of it is missing, and that's actually a good thing because it means that we got rid of the lens distortion. Of course, these two don't blend in together at all, but it's a good start. So now that we actually have this render working, we can talk about the issue I talked about earlier with this optical center, which kind of makes our background image go to the top right. So I'm just going to play this and go to a frame like this one, let's say, and then we're going to take our crater, G, Y, to move it on the Y-axis, and then I'm just going to align it to something that's pretty easy to see. So for example, maybe this right here, this parking line. So we're going to just move it so these corners are touching. And the reason I want to do this is in the viewport, it looks like these corners are perfectly touching, but when we do a render, you're going to see that because of this offset, one of the things that's going to happen because of that is the corners will no longer be touching. So let's actually see that. So F12. Okay, perfect. Again, don't worry about the fact that it looks very grainy in all this because we did 2 render samples, but just look at where these corners are. So these are no longer touching at the corners, which means that because our image was offsetted a little, we put our crater where we thought was the right position, but it actually wasn't. So that is why this is an issue. And also, before we fix that, you're going to notice that this crater kind of has a red hue to it if we look at the side of the stone here. And of course, that's because in the shading, and back to world, we made this red, which is actually the lighting that this is interacting with. So we're just going to go back to a neutral gray. And to do that, we're going to take our saturation, bring that down so we get white. And for our vibrance, I think it was already at 0.25. Yeah, so let's just keep it at 0.25. Okay, so now we have this gray back. And we want to take care of this corner issue. Now there's actually 2 approaches to fixing this. We're going to talk about the differences between them. So either way, you're going to have to select your camera, and then in the camera properties, you're going to see background images. This is where we added in the background image. Pretty self-explanatory. And we have some settings here called offset, and as you expect, we can move these, and that lets us center it. Now that's one approach to solving this. The other is using this shift X and Y. Now the difference between shifting and offsetting is this offsetting is basically moving this background image but keeping our camera stationary, and shifting in some sense moves our camera, kind of, not really, but it also moves this background image. So one moves only the background image and the other moves both. And there's advantages and disadvantages to using both. First of all, if we do our shifting, you're going to notice that these empties right here, which correspond to our tracking markers, you're going to notice that they move with the footage. And already, since this is offset, they're not where we expect them to be. So this tracker should be pretty much at this dot, I'm fairly certain, and this tracker right here should be on this white dot, so you can tell that there's an issue here. So shifting might not be the way to go. However, if we do shifting, we can just type in 0, 0 to get it nice and centered, so that's one advantage. And then the other way to go, as we said, is offsetting. But the issue here is we don't know exactly how much to offset it by. Somebody in the comments left a mathematical explanation on how to do this, so reference that if you want an exact answer. But when we move this, notice that since only the background image is moving, relative to the background image, these empties are moving in some sense. So if we move this, you're going to see that our empties are now moving to where they should be. So we can just adjust our X and Y, and we can see if this is aligned by either checking our empties or just checking the framing in general, making sure that it's no longer in the corner. I'm just going to zoom back in here. Okay, I think this is pretty centered. We of course can do better, but I don't see this as a big issue. Okay, so this is now centered, and notice that our crater is now no longer in the corner. In fact, it's in the same position as our render. I guess we need to render this again, but if you remember, we had this issue before where it was kind of not touching corners but above it. So this is what was actually happening in our compositing. So now that we have this correct, we can position our crater accurately to what's going to be rendered. So with this crater, let's do G and then Y and bring this back a bit. And let's just zoom in here so we can see what we're doing. There we go. Okay, so now we have our corners touching again, but this time with our offset and all that, so the positioning is actually correct, or very nearly correct. So in our compositing, since we already have our node network, we can just hit F12, And notice that this time the corners are indeed touching. It doesn't look exactly correct, but that is because of this pixelated border, because we're only doing 2 samples. We can just bump it up one time just so we can see what we're doing. Let's do 20 samples, which isn't that much, but should be significantly better. You can see it's taking longer to render. Yeah, so this is already a better result. And notice that we actually have some motion blur here, which is another reason why we have this weird jagged edge. It needs to calculate all our motion blur. And in this case, when I filmed the footage at a very high or low shutter speed, 1/500, if you know what that means. And basically that means that my footage had very little motion blur. So it's almost accurate to even disable motion blur since there's so little. So let's actually render again. Probably should have gone back down to 2 samples, but this is fine. Yeah, now you can see we have this nice crisp edge. If your footage has motion blur, you can tweak the motion blur settings by enabling it and then also messing with your shutter to get everything aligning correctly in terms of motion blur, but we're not going to deal with that. Okay, so we now have everything aligned properly, so we can do our hiding the side trick that I was talking about. Again, we don't want to see the stone over here. We want it to look like our footage, and there's a bunch of ways to go about this. I already mentioned that we want to do it with projections because it's probably the coolest way to do it, in my opinion. So with this selected, we can go to the Material tab, and like we talked about, we have our materials. And if we go into Edit mode and pick, let's say, coal, and then click Select, it's going to show us all the faces that have coal in it, which you can see is correct because all these faces indeed are coal. So we can do this with iron, which is going to select those as well. It's just going to add to our selection. If we want to deselect and then select, it's going to have only our iron and so on. So what we're going to do is we're going to add in a new material, so add in a new slot. So now we have 5 slots, and in the slot we need to pick what material should occupy the slot. And we can either pick a material that already exists, but of course we want to make a material for our projections. So I'm just going to make a new material, and we can call it, I don't know, I guess we can call it projections. Creativity is not going to get any better in this part 3, but there we go, we have projections, and right now it's just a default white material. But it's not actually assigned to anything, which is why we're not seeing it. Now, where do we actually want this material? Well, we want it anywhere where we basically want to hide the crater. So that's on the top here and also on the side. And in our camera view, we can't see the faces back here. So that is, I think that's these back here, so we don't need to apply to these, but basically anything that is not looking right. So this one, this one, this one. And notice that we can't do our normal control clicking because of how we actually modeled this. They're kind of disconnected pieces. So what we have to do is basically do a bunch of shift clicking. So I'm just going to fast forward through this part so you can see what we actually need to select. Okay, so I've made a base selection here, and now what we want to do is play through the footage to make sure that at no point we see a face that we shouldn't, that isn't already selected, so we can just play this. And we might want to transition over to Eevee to get something that doesn't look like a glitchy mess that takes forever. So Render tab, switch over to Eevee, and now let's see. Yeah, this was probably the way to go from the beginning. Okay. I think this is looking good, so what we want to do is basically imagine that everything that is selected in yellowish, orange, whatever color that really is, we want to imagine that that selection is basically our footage. So imagine that it's not there, and with that we only get this interior of the crater. So again, notice that I didn't have to really select everything, like these are never seen by the camera, so I can just keep them as is, but this is a pretty good selection. So back in the Material tab, with our projections, again, make sure you have your selection, make sure you're in the projections slot with your projections material. So with this, we're just going to click assign, and it's going to assign our basic white material, which is looking gray because of the world background is gray, and that's the color that it's reflecting. But there you go, it's looking pretty good. So now all we have to do is change this from white over to our footage with window coordinates is what we're going to be using. So if you don't know what that is, don't worry about it. We're going to explain it, or I'm going to explain it in a second. So back in the shading tab, right now we want to go to our object. So we're looking at the individual material, in this case projections. And instead of this white, like we said, we want to replace it with our footage. So we don't need this principled BSDF, so X to delete. And what we're going to do is we're going to first of all import in our image sequence. So Shift A, type in image texture for an image texture node. We're going to hook this up to the surface output for the material output here. So I guess it's the surface slot for the material output. And again, this is what gets seen on the surface of our object. And inside this node, we're going to load in, should be on the desktop. Now we don't want to load in the original sequence since we're going to be overlaying this crater over the undistorted thing. If you remember in compositing, we have our undistorted part of the network and then we're overlaying the crater. So we want to import in this undistorted sequence that we rendered out in the last tutorial. And that is why we were thinking ahead, because I knew that we would need this. So import that in, and you're going to notice that it's looking like the footage is there, but it's looking very incorrect. Just make sure that cyclic is enabled. Basically, that means when it gets to the end of our sequence, it's going to go right back to frame 1, so it doesn't just end there and then go to black. And then we're going to also enable auto refresh, which means it refreshes every single frame because it's an image sequence. So what do we do to actually correct this mess? Well, what we can do is play around with texture coordinates. So right now this is just a image sequence. This is what we're putting on our mesh, but we also need to give Blender instructions on how to put it. And that is what texture coordinates are. So if you don't already have Node Wrangler enabled, go to Edit, Preferences. I might have already talked about this, but you go to Add-ons and then type in Node Wrangler and make sure that this is enabled because it's going to let us do some shortcuts like Control-T with this node selected. Control-T is going to give us our mapping and texture coordinates node. I can't remember if we already talked about this or not, but basically these two nodes are going to be very useful for what we're trying to do. And right now it's using the UV coordinates. We already know about UV from making the cubes from before, but instead we want to use something called window coordinates. So we're just going to hook that up instead. Now we already see something that's looking a bit better, and what this is doing is you want to imagine that the footage or the image sequence is playing on your screen, and then it's just projecting forward onto the mesh. Kind of like a window, so windowed coordinates. So if we go to our camera view, which is the correct perspective, you're going to see that everything is lining up because we're just taking our footage and projecting it forwards onto the mesh from the perspective of the moving camera that represents our camera that we filmed with. So obviously everything's going to align. So let's just, again, notice that if we go into the 3D viewport, it's no longer going to be aligned. Just a quick note. So let's go back to layout so we can see what we're doing. So now in the 3D viewport, we're just going to play this. And notice that inside this viewport, it's actually playing pretty slowly because we're using EV with a bunch of windowed coordinates. It's not going to be the fastest thing, even though it's EV, but you can tell that it's doing pretty much the correct thing here. And in fact, if we just pick a frame, switch back over to cycles, and then let's do compositing and do a quick render on frame 1. Again, I need to remember to go back to frame 2. You're going to notice that everything blends in perfectly. Anywhere where we would see the exterior of the crater, we now have the footage overlaying on top of that. So effectively, we found a perfect way to hide this. So now we just need to do some final corrections. So for example, the lighting here is really bad, and we still have some lens distortion that we don't want. So first of all, let's deal with the lens distortion because it's actually pretty easy. So again, just going over this network, we have our footage that's being undistorted and then going into this alpha over. And then we also have our render layers, which is going into the foreground, which is already undistorted because it's just in our 3D viewport. And in fact, we're projecting with our windowed coordinates, we're projecting our undistorted image sequence. So basically everything that's being overlaid in this alpha over node is the undistorted version of what we want. So now what we can do is take this and then just redistort. So we're working with undistorted things and then we're just going to distort it right back. So we're going to take our undistortion node, Shift D to duplicate. We're going to put it in between our alpha over and our viewer. And instead of undistort, which is basically going to undistort it a second time, which is not what we want, that kind of compounds our issue, we're going to take this and set it to distort. So basically we undistorted and then distorted. So they're inverse operations and cancel out. And I think we already talked about this. Since we already calculated the lens distortion from our camera tracking, we can either use that information to get rid of the lens distortion or apply it again. So that's why we can change this back over to distort. And now you can see that everything is a perfect rectangle. We don't have this weird corner. And now we want to just take care of the lighting. So in layout, just go in here. Now notice that when we do this, our windowed coordinates are going to kind of mess up, but we don't care about this because we know we're going to render from our camera view. So just kind of ignore that for now. So we want to take our light in the light settings, and we just want to make this a bit stronger and also maybe match the lighting of our scene. This is kind of an awkward example because we don't see any shadows in our footage, so maybe that indicates that the light is directly from above, it's midday or something. So we want to make sure that this light is perfectly above. Doesn't have to be perfect. I do want to have a bit of shadows coming from the side to give this a bit of dimension, but it is coming from the top, and it's also very overcast, meaning that the shadows are very diffuse, they're not very sharp. And we already talked about how the size of the light matters, so bigger the light size, the more diffuse the shadow is going to be. So let's do something like 7 maybe, just soften it a bit, and also take the power of it. And we can either do that from our power or just turn up our emission strength. And I'm going to go for emission strength. And let's bring it up to something like 200. So double it. And we can see from our camera view. Okay, so that's looking about the correct brightness, I would say. Yeah, I think I'm okay with that. And now the final touch I want to do is I really do not like the positioning of this. So I'm going to take our crater and then also our light. So it's going to be moving with it. And then we just want to adjust the position of this. But I accidentally deselected it. So let's try that again. I'm going to reposition it just anywhere you like because our windowed coordinates are going to update automatically. It's a very procedural kind of approach. If you want to think about it that way, nothing's baked in. So we're just going to move it along the x-axis and then along the y-axis. And again, I'm going to say this again because it's very cool. The setup we have pretty much lets us put our crater wherever we want. The only thing we can't do is take our crater and rotate it to the other side where we didn't put our new material because it's just going to show the stone. But we can perfectly do this without any issues. Yep, okay, so let's just do a final render on one of the frames, and I'll show you how to export this as a movie file, and then we'll call it a done job, as it were. So in compositing, we'll do this on frame 29. Again, we need a render to update this, so let's do a save, and then hit render with F12. This is looking good, and boom, there we go, a crater that blends in perfectly. And also notice that I didn't mention it, but our distortion that we're adding back in is only happening on the viewer level, so we need to add this back into our composite, which is what gets rendered. We'll do this again, and this time we're not going to have that weird corner that I didn't address. Come on. There we go. So now everything is taking up the whole frame, and it should be looking pretty good. And you can spend a lot of time matching this lighting. You know, I just did it very, very roughly with a single light that's roughly in the position of the sun. So it's not that good of a job. You can do better. Please do better. Use this tutorial as a stepping stone to what you can achieve. But yeah, that is basically the deal. If you want to render this out as a full video, what you can do is in the Output tab, we're going to have it as a 30 frames per second video using all the frames from 1 to 121. And then what I like to do, you can export it out as a image sequence again with our crater and everything composited together. But what I like to do is set this over to FFmpeg video. And then for encoding, we're going to be using MP4. That's generally what you upload to YouTube. So I use MP4 or MPEG-4. And then H.264 is fine, you know, at high quality, but we're just going to keep it on medium. And then you just want to set a directory for this where it's going to output, and we'll just call this test video. And I think that should be good. Yep, make sure that your color space is good. So in render tab, color management, view transform, that's on standard, which in this case is what we want. If we did filmic, it would mess with the look of our original image sequence. So Control F12 to render out this animation. And since I want to do this on video, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to drop the samples down to 2. So we're going to get a really grainy render, but we'll get the idea of it. So maybe we'll render like 20 frames or something just to make sure that it's working. But for now, I guess I can just talk about, you know, this is the end of a tutorial. I mean, I hope you guys enjoyed this 3-part journey. I know in this video specifically, I ended up stuttering a lot. I have to edit a lot of those out, but hopefully it's not too annoying. I find it annoying, so I edit it out. But yeah, so this is the end of a tutorial. If you guys enjoy what I do and want to fund more tutorials like these, well, what you can do is I have a Patreon. You can donate over there. You get benefits like behind the scenes content, so you're also kind of buying something with your money. But yeah, that is kind of the deal. Okay, so let's say that this is enough. Hopefully if we close this mid-render, it saves our first 18 frames or whatever. So let's see, we have our test video. Should be very short. Yep, that is a very short video indeed, but you can see that it's moving correctly. The lighting is looking okay, and we don't see the side of it, which is kind of the part that most people get confused by. So there you go. That's the tutorial. Donate if you want to, and I hope you guys enjoyed it. Bye-bye.